What does a better life look like? For the Jemison family, it was a farm on the Pennsylvania frontier. That dream ended in blood. For their daughter Mary, a better life was unexpectedly found after being captured by Shawnee warriors and adopted by the Seneca. She would outlive her husbands and her own children to become a respected landowner. Her story asks a disturbing question: what if the life you were born to live isn't the one where you truly belong? For Thomas and Jane Jemison, a better life looked like the wide, open horizon of America, a promise of prosperity that came directly from the soil. Fleeing the hardships of Ireland, they sailed aboard the ship William and Mary, a vessel carrying the collective weight of their ambitions. Their daughter, Mary, was born on that crossing, a child of the Atlantic delivered into a new world. After landing in Philadelphia, they pushed west to the Pennsylvania frontier and established a farm at Marsh Creek. However, that dream of a life built with their own hands would ultimately end in blood. For their daughter Mary, a different and entirely unexpected better life was found after being captured by Shawnee warriors and adopted by the Seneca. She would outlive her husbands and her own children to become a respected landowner, leaving a story that asks a disturbing question: what if the life you were born to live isn't the one where you truly belong? For 7 or 8 years, their gamble paid off handsomely. The Jemison family carved a thriving farm out of the wilderness, a testament to their relentless work ethic. Their world was one of relative peace, a quiet bubble on the edge of a continent in turmoil. The only immediate threats seemed to come from the landscape itself, the howl of a wolf in the distance or the scream of a panther in the deep woods. These were the predictable dangers of nature, not the chaotic violence of men. They had cordial relationships with their settler neighbors and even peaceful, if infrequent, interactions with the Native Americans who passed through the region. They were living the dream they had chased across an ocean, unaware that they had built their home directly on top of a geopolitical fault line that was about to rupture. The year was 1758, and the background noise of the French and Indian War was growing louder. This wasn't a local dispute, it was a theater of the global 7 Years' War, a brutal contest between two European empires for control of the resource-rich Ohio Valley. The French and their native allies, including warriors from the Shawnee and some Seneca clans, had made a terrifying strategy of raiding the British frontier, turning settlements like the one at Marsh Creek into soft targets. Whispers and warnings of these attacks became more frequent, but for a farmer like Thomas Jemison, the rhythm of the seasons was a more immediate reality than the movements of distant armies. He heard the rumors, but he also saw his fields, heavy with crops that promised another year of security. He made a fateful decision: they would stay for one more harvest. It was a classic miscalculation, the kind of optimistic gamble that builds farms and dooms families. He looked at his land and saw his future, not the approaching threat. At this time, Mary was about 15 years old, a young woman on the cusp of her own life, not the 12-year-old girl her memory would later insist on. She was a daughter of the frontier, accustomed to the hard work and simple certainties of the farm. But the world of her childhood, that small pocket of cultivated peace, was about to be erased. The larger, more violent world of empires and warriors was coming for its harvest, and her family was on the list. The morning of the 5th of April, 1758, began like any other. It was an ordinary spring day, filled with the mundane tasks of farm life. Mary's father was repairing an axe handle, her mother was preparing breakfast, and her brothers were working near the barn. A neighbor, Robert Buck, had stopped by to retrieve a horse. The scene was a portrait of domestic tranquility, a fragile peace that was shattered by the sudden crack of gunfire. Outside the cabin, Robert Buck and his horse crumpled to the ground, the first casualties of a morning that would descend into a nightmare. A war party of 6 Shawnee warriors and 4 French soldiers swarmed the property, their movements swift and terrifyingly efficient. They overwhelmed the family instantly, taking them captive without any real resistance. The only stroke of luck, if it could be called that, was that Mary's 2 older brothers, Thomas and John, were in the barn at a distance and managed to escape into the woods, becoming the sole survivors of the family they knew. Inside the cabin, the attackers wasted no time. They plundered the home, grabbing everything of value or use, from bread and cornmeal to meat. The family was then bound and herded out of the life they had built, forced into the dense forest at a brutal pace. A warrior walked at the rear, using a leather whip to drive the children forward, transforming them from a family into a column of prisoners. The first day of their journey was a blur of relentless walking, fueled by terror and silenced by exhaustion. They were given no food, no water, no rest. When night fell, they collapsed onto the cold ground under the strict watch of their captors, the silence of the forest now more menacing than it had ever been. On the second day, a cruel irony was served for breakfast. The warriors handed out the very bread and meat they had stolen from the Jemison pantry. It was a psychological blow, a reminder that their captors now owned everything, even their last meal. Mary's father, already lost in a sea of despair, refused to eat. His silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket of grief. This was the last time Mary would hear him speak. That night, huddled in a damp swamp, a single gesture sealed her family's fate and secured her own survival. A Shawnee warrior approached and handed her a pair of soft deerskin moccasins, gesturing for her to exchange them for her own hard shoes. Her mother saw the exchange and understood its meaning with horrifying clarity. Moccasins were for long journeys. They were not giving them to her parents or her younger siblings. In that moment, she knew Mary was being spared, chosen to be taken away while the rest of them were destined for a much shorter final journey. Mustering the last of her strength, she pulled Mary close and gave her a final, desperate set of instructions. "Do not forget your name," she whispered, "or your father's name. Remember your prayers, and do not, under any circumstances, try to escape. They will catch you, and they will kill you." The boy captured with them was also given moccasins, another soul selected for life. Then, Mary was pulled away from her mother, led in a different direction. The last thing she ever heard from her family was her mother's voice calling after her, "Don't cry, Mary. God bless you. Farewell." That night, Mary could not sleep. The other boy begged her to run away with him, but her mother's warning was a fresh, raw wound in her mind. She refused. The next morning, when the main party of warriors returned, her family was gone. A day later, the horrifying truth was revealed, not in words, but in a gruesome ritual. She watched in silent terror as the warriors stretched fresh scalps on hoops to clean and dry them. She saw the familiar reddish tint of her mother's hair, the color of her father's, the hair of her brothers and sisters. It was the undeniable, physical proof of their slaughter. Her old life wasn't just over. It had been turned into a war trophy. As they continued their march, one warrior meticulously walked at the back of the line, using a stick to fluff up the blades of grass they had trod upon, erasing their trail and wiping away every last trace of the world Mary Jemison had once known. The journey that followed the massacre of her family was a descent into a gray, frozen hell. Mary, along with the young neighborhood boy, was pushed onward through relentless cold rain and late spring snow. The world became a miserable blur of mud, tangled undergrowth, and the constant chilling presence of her captors. Any thought of her previous life was a luxury she couldn't afford. Every ounce of energy was focused on placing one foot in front of the other to avoid the sting of the whip. During this punishing trek, they encountered another war party, who had with them a young white man, a prisoner like themselves. He was a stranger, exhausted and terrified, but his presence provided a flicker of comfort. In a world where she had lost everyone, seeing another face that shared her predicament was a small anchor, a brief reminder that she was not entirely alone in this nightmare. Eventually, the ragged group arrived on the outskirts of Fort Duquesne, the strategic French stronghold built at the confluence of 3 rivers, the future site of Pittsburgh. This was no mere wilderness outpost. It was a bustling hub of military power, the nerve center of the French war effort in the Ohio Valley. Here, the journey took another bizarre, ritualistic turn. The Shawnee warriors took Mary and painted her face and hair with a vibrant red pigment. It was a ceremonial act loaded with meaning she couldn't yet comprehend. It could have been the mark of a prisoner destined for a grim fate within the fort, or it could have been the preparation for a different kind of life, a symbolic claiming of her for the native world. She was being rebranded, her identity stripped away and replaced with a color that signaled a profound change in her status. The next morning, the finality of her situation became brutally clear. Her last 2 connections to her old world, the young man from the trail and the boy from her neighborhood, were formally handed over to the French soldiers at the fort. She watched them disappear into the military apparatus, never to be seen by her again. Now, she was completely alone, a 15-year-old girl surrounded by foreign warriors and a foreign language. Her past severed, and her future a terrifying blank. It was at this moment of total isolation that two Seneca women appeared. They approached her not with aggression, but with a quiet, unnerving curiosity. They examined her from head to toe, their hands checking her limbs, their eyes appraising her health and strength as if she were a prize horse. After their thorough inspection, they seemed satisfied, turning to speak with her Shawnee captors in a language she did not understand. A transaction was taking place. A life was being traded. For a collection of goods or weapons, Mary Jemison was officially passed from the Shawnee warriors who had stolen her to the Seneca women who had just bought her. Her new life began on the water, in a canoe gliding down the Ohio River. This was not a journey of peace. At the bow of the canoe, her captors had planted a pole, and from it flew the gruesome trophies of their raid, the scalps of her mother, her father, and her siblings. The long red hair of her mother danced in the breeze, a constant, visceral reminder of everything she had lost. Every mile they traveled downriver was a mile further into a world defined by that horror. The trip provided another soul-scarring memory when they passed a Shawnee village. On the riverbank were the charred and blackened posts where white prisoners had been tortured to death. The sight of those remains, the silent testament to unspeakable suffering, burned itself into her mind, a vision of the fate she had so narrowly avoided. This was the world she now inhabited, one where such brutality was a part of the landscape. They finally reached their destination, a small Seneca town at the mouth of the Scioto River. Here, the two women who had claimed her led her ashore. She would later learn the reason for her abduction. She had been taken as part of a custom known as a mourning war. The brother of her two new sisters had been killed a year earlier in a battle with George Washington's colonial forces. Her life was meant to replace his. In Iroquois culture, a prisoner taken in a raid could either be ritually tortured to allow the grieving family to vent their sorrow, or they could be formally adopted, their living presence filling the spiritual and demographic hole left by the deceased. Mary had been chosen for the latter. She was not just a captive, she was medicine for a grieving family. The adoption ceremony was a powerful and symbolic act of transformation. Her new sisters led her from the canoe, took her tattered and filthy European clothes, and threw them into the river, a gesture meant to wash away her past, her family, and her white blood. They then led her into the water, bathing her gently before dressing her in the clean, comfortable clothes of a Seneca woman. With this ritual, the family's performance of grief was commanded to end, replaced by a celebration of return. They welcomed her, not as a prisoner, but as their lost sibling brought back from the dead. They gave her a new name, Dickawamis, meaning a pretty girl or a pleasant thing. Mary Jemison was gone, and Dickawamis had been born. She was treated with immediate tenderness and affection by her new family, yet she remained adrift in a sea of loneliness, haunted by the ghosts of her true family. While her new sisters forbade her from speaking English, she would secretly repeat her childhood prayers and catechism, a quiet rebellion to keep the last embers of her old identity from going cold. By 1762, the map of power had been redrawn. The French had lost Fort Duquesne to the British, who renamed it Fort Pitt. In this new era of tense negotiations, Mary's Seneca family traveled to the area, setting up camp across the river from the formidable British fort. For Mary, who now went by Dickawamis, the sight of the fort and the white soldiers and traders milling about was a profound shock to her system. For the first time in years, she was seeing the world she had been stolen from. It wasn't a memory anymore. It was real, tangible, and just across the water. A desperate, long-buried hope for rescue surged within her, a powerful and dizzying feeling that threatened to overwhelm the quiet contentment she had found. Her heart pounded with the possibility of returning, of being Mary Jemison again. Her presence did not go unnoticed. A few of the white men at the fort saw the European girl living among the Seneca and began asking questions, trying to learn her name and the circumstances of her capture. The moment her Seneca sisters sensed this interest, they panicked. In their eyes, the British were not rescuers. They were a threat who would tear their adopted daughter and sister away from them. Their response was swift and decisive. Under the cover of darkness, they hustled Mary into a canoe and paddled furiously away from the fort, disappearing back into the wilderness. She would later learn that a party of white men had indeed been sent to find her, but her family's desperate flight had been too quick. They were long gone. For Mary, this escape was not a relief. It was a devastating blow, a loss so profound she would later describe it as her second captivity. The first had been physical, a violent removal from her home. This one was psychological, the slamming of a door that had been briefly, tantalizingly cracked open. The sudden, violent extinguishing of that rekindled hope was, in some ways, more painful than the initial abduction. It forced a final, heartbreaking acceptance of her fate. The world of her birth was now truly lost to her. Yet, like all deep wounds, this one too eventually began to scar over. As time passed, the intense grief of this lost chance faded, and she slowly settled back into the rhythms of Seneca life, the peace returning, but this time with a hardened edge of finality. Her integration was no longer just an act of survival. It was becoming her reality. Life moved on, dictated by the seasons and the needs of her community. Her family moved between different settlements, and in a town called Wishto, they came to live alongside a group of Delaware people. It was there that her Seneca sisters made a decision that would cement her place in their world forever. They arranged for her to be married to a Delaware warrior named Shawnee. There was no elaborate ceremony. They were joined in the common law Indian style, a simple and practical recognition of their union. For Mary, it was another step away from her past, another choice made for her. But the man they chose for her would defy every expectation a captive might have. Mary described Shawnee not as a fearsome savage, but as a man of noble character, tall, handsome, generous, and consistently kind. He was a respected warrior, but with her, he was gentle. Though she entered the marriage out of duty to her adoptive family, Shawnee's character slowly won her over. In a statement that powerfully captures the strange turn her life had taken, she later recalled, "Strange as it may seem, I loved him." In the heart of a world she had been forced into, with a man from a people she was taught to fear, she found a genuine and happy marriage. This was the ultimate contradiction, a loving home founded on the ashes of her family's destruction. Their new life together was soon touched by both sorrow and joy. Mary gave birth to their first child, a daughter, who was tragically frail and died after only 2 days. In the aftermath, Mary herself fell gravely ill, her life hanging in the balance until the dedicated care of Shawnee and her sisters nursed her back to health. The following winter, however, brought a lasting joy. She gave birth to a strong, healthy son. In a powerful act of bridging her two worlds, she gave him the name Thomas Jemison, in honor of the father she had lost. It was a quiet declaration that while she was now Dikawamis, wife of Shawnee, a part of Mary Jemison and her history would endure. She later reflected that if not for the haunting memory of her murdered family, her contentment would have been absolute. She had found her place. With her husband Shawnee and her young son Thomas, Mary began a long and arduous journey toward the Genesee Valley, the heartland of the Seneca people. This was a migration from the periphery of her new world to its very center. But the frontier was a landscape saturated with violence, a place where peace was a temporary illusion between brutal acts. Near a trading post, their journey was halted by a grim discovery: the bodies of 3 white men floating in a river. Fearing they would be blamed for the killings, a common danger for any native person in a contested area, they cautiously approached the post. There, they walked into a scene of calculated cruelty. A group of Shawnee warriors were torturing a young white prisoner, methodically slicing his ears, gashing his face, and beating him without mercy. This was the casual brutality Mary had seen before, the terrifying reality of frontier warfare. But something in her had changed. She was no longer just a terrified captive. She was a mother, the wife of a respected warrior, and a member of a community. Moved by a profound sense of compassion, she began to weep, openly pleading with the Shawnee warriors to show mercy and stop the torture. It was an incredibly bold and dangerous act, yet, remarkably, they listened. Perhaps it was the surprising sight of a white woman, fully integrated and speaking on behalf of another white person, that gave them pause. They ceased their torture and released the young man, who stumbled away into the forest, disappearing forever. In that moment, Mary Jemison had found her voice, an influence she didn't know she possessed. This brief moment of newfound agency was immediately crushed by a personal tragedy. Continuing their journey east, her husband Shawnee, the kind and noble man she had grown to love, fell suddenly and violently ill. They stopped for days to let him rest, but his condition only worsened. On a lonely stretch of trail, far from family and friends, Shawnee died. The loss was absolute. Mary was now a widow with a toddler son, stranded in an unfamiliar wilderness, her protector and companion gone. The security she had found, the life she had built with him, was shattered in an instant, leaving her to face the final leg of her journey utterly alone. After a grueling journey, Mary and her son Thomas finally reached the Genesee Valley in what is now western New York. She found her late husband's relatives and was welcomed into the community, her status as a widow affording her a measure of respect and protection. In time, she remarried, this time to a formidable Seneca warrior named Hiokatu. He was a man of fearsome reputation, much older than her, and known for his ferocity and brutality during wartime campaigns. He was, by all accounts, a killer. Yet within the home he was a kind and gentle husband to Mary and a good father to their growing family. This stark contradiction was the reality of her life, a peaceful home presided over by a man capable of immense violence. With Hiokatu, she had 6 more children, raising them all firmly within the Seneca culture. Years passed. The American Revolution came and went, and treaties were signed that included provisions for the return of all white captives. Mary's brothers, the 2 boys who had escaped the raid all those years ago, learned she was alive and made the long journey to find her. They pleaded with her to return with them, to leave the Seneca and rejoin white society. Mary refused. Her decision was born of a complex love and a pragmatic fear. She adored her children, and she knew with absolute certainty that these half-native children would be despised outcasts in the white world. Furthermore, the Seneca were her people now. Their way of life was her way of life. This was her home. Mary Jemison didn't just stay, she mastered her new world. At the Treaty of Big Tree in 1797, while Seneca leaders were negotiating away huge tracts of land, Mary, the former captive, shrewdly maneuvered to secure her own title. With the backing of influential chiefs who respected her, she was granted ownership of nearly 18,000 acres along the Genesee River, a parcel that became known as the Gardeau Tract. This move made her an independently wealthy and powerful landowner, an almost unthinkable status for any woman of that era, white or native. She became a living legend, known as the White Woman of the Genesee. At the age of 80, she finally told her story to a local minister, creating the narrative that would preserve her incredible life. She died in 1833, a 90-year-old matriarch who had lived a life stranger than any fiction, a bridge between 2 worlds who ultimately chose the one that had claimed her by force. Mary Jemison was kidnapped by warriors but found a strange kind of savage love, refusing rescue to become a powerful Seneca matriarch. Her life proves that the line between savage and civilized is a matter of perspective. History is rarely the story you think you know. For more uncomfortable truths, subscribe.